On today's World Insight, G7 nations in a virtual meeting to take up global security concerns, with Afghanistan a hot topic, threats of Taliban sanctions and a looming deadline for full withdrawal. What's on the agenda? And a Chinese military strategist pulls no punches in explaining why China looks forward to being in step with Afghanistan after the hasty retreat of U.S. and allied forces.
China is one of the largest trading partners of Afghanistan.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the latest in Afghanistan. The G7 is holding an emergency virtual meeting on Tuesday to discuss ongoing challenges in Afghanistan. The word ahead of the meeting is the G7 will discuss whether to impose sanctions or officially recognize the Taliban to encourage an inclusive government. A decision also has to be made whether the U.S. will heed appeals from allies to delay the August 31st deadline of a full withdrawal of forces. The Taliban warns of consequences if the U.S. delays complete withdrawal. The Guardian called the G7 meeting a gathering of vanquished, highlighting disappointment in the messy drawdown of allied forces. Meanwhile, reports confirmed CIA Director William Burns met Taliban leader Abdul Baradar in Kabul. What do all these developments mean? Let's loop in our panelists. And now we are joined by a panel on the G7 meeting on Afghanistan. In Chapel Hill, U.S., Klaus Laris, a distinguished professor of history and international affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's originally coming from Germany. In Washington, D.C., Brian Becker, executive director of the Answer Coalition. Last but not least, in Beijing, China, XIYU, senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. As we speak, things are evolving in a dramatic speed. The latest is about the CIA director meeting with the political leader of the Taliban. Now, Professor Laris, your quick response to the latest.
Yeah, that was quite surprising that the CIA director has met with the Taliban leader, one of its leaders, but it clearly is an attempt by the Biden association to find out whether the Taliban would be open to a slight extension of the deadline of bringing the refugees home, like a few days or maybe a week. We don't know the result of that conversation yet, but I'm sure we will find out soon. And as has been said before, Biden at the moment is squeezed between the allies and the Taliban. The allies want an extension, and apparently the Taliban don't want to give that extension.
About the CIA director's meeting with the political leader and one of the chief negotiators in Qatar, actually, it is according to the Washington Post report. We have not yet confirmed. At this moment, we are talking by the official sides from both sides about this meeting. We'll see how things would evolve. Having said that, though, let me jump directly into some of the issues related to G7. Mr. Becker, we see a division among the G7 about the deadline of withdrawal, about the U.S. chaotic, quote-unquote, handling of the withdrawal, and about whether the U.S. leadership is the right one since the agreement in Doha was reached. Mr. Becker.
Yeah, this is a major embarrassment for the United States writ large. It's also, of course, a big embarrassment for the Biden administration. When the United States used the article in NATO triggering a NATO response to the September 11th attack, all of the NATO partners agreed to participate in the invasion and then occupation of Afghanistan. But it was the United States unilaterally that decided that by September 11th, the U.S. was going to pull out, and that the United States anticipated that Kabul could fall perhaps in 18 months or maybe 90 days. But Joe Biden proceeded unilaterally, announced the withdrawal, said it was happening, confirmed that it was happening. And then as the government army fell apart, imploded, the allies who were part of the occupation for 20 years were left standing. I mean, the United States said, yes, we're leaving, but British troops are also there. British soldiers have also died there. And so, of course, Boris Johnson convened this emergency meeting because while Joe Biden said the U.S. is leaving definitely by August 31st, the UK has not agreed to leave by August 31st. The UK official position is that they're not leaving until British citizens are evacuated.
Right.
So there's an extreme tension between the allies in NATO as a consequence of the U.S. handling of its exit from Afghanistan.
As the four of us are discussing here, we are not yet having the confirmed information about the conclusion of the G7 virtual meeting on Afghanistan yet. But Mr. Yang, many of the topics likely to be discussed we know very well. Now, some of the divides earlier mentioned by our panelists, do you see there is any hope of a solution?
Well, no. Actually, both for Biden and the American allies have a very difficult situation, and they are all of the Western countries now in very difficult position, not only because of the different concerns and the worries between U.S. and its allies, but also the different position, different requests between from Taliban and the allied states like UK, and the contradiction requests from UK and Taliban really make U.S. in a really difficult position, and answer remain unclear. However, besides the deadline of withdrawal, another more fundamental, more substantive issue is how Biden administration should set the new position towards the upcoming Taliban regime after fighting against them for 20 years.
That's another issue we really want to handle. That is the attitude of the G7 as a whole toward the Taliban regime, likely. But let's talk about the division within the G7 itself. Professor Laris, do you see there is a hope with this meeting that things can be resolved to a certain extent?
Internally, I think they will be at each other's throats and will really have been very displeased with each other. To the outside world, they probably will try to present a united front after this meeting and say they all have agreed on a certain point of view. But I think this is just for the outside world. Internally, they are very, very divided. And it is pretty clear that the Biden administration has proven to be, at least in this issue, quite incompetent, cannot manage the withdrawal in an orderly fashion. And of course, the allies have concluded that that sudden withdrawal was much too abrupt. And also the Biden administration decided to withdraw its military first, like at Bagram Air Base, rather than look after the civilian evacuees. And this is, of course, not the way to do it. It should be the other way around. And the allies know that, Biden knows that, and they will be really deeply divided, but to the outside world, they will try to present a united front, I'm sure.
There are two other points we really need to mention here. One is that the Biden administration, President Biden himself, in a recent speech to the American people, he talked about the goals of American troops there is not about rebuilding Afghanistan, it's not about building local democracies. However, I really wonder when he said that, whether he's really representing his colleagues of other G7 nations who, for example, Germany, have been vowing to try to contribute to the rebuilding of Afghanistan for years. So it seems that there is a huge difference now, even about the goals of the mission after the mission was almost, quote unquote, complete. Mr. Laris, very briefly.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, nation building has become a bad word in the United States, but it is obvious if you go into a country, you occupy that country for 20 years, what are you supposed to do but to build that nation and to turn that nation into a constructive, civilian-run government which actually looks after its people, where human rights are observed and these kind of things. And so I think it is just a slogan for the American public who somehow dislike being involved in foreign countries and do some nation building work. But everyone knows that, of course, if you occupy a country for 20 years, nation building is the goal.
Right.
And the Western allies will not give up on that. They will put humanitarian aid into Afghanistan. They will put developmental aid into Afghanistan even once the Taliban have taken over properly, and hope that the civilian society, which has developed, at least to some extent in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, that will be maintained to some extent.
We'll have to see, because there are enormous amount of humanitarian crisis that's already going on, Mr. Becker. I guess we need to really discuss something about that, particularly the internally displaced person, and also the huge amount of the Afghanistan refugees going to the other countries, but the United States.
Right. I mean, there's obviously going to be a refugee crisis. When you think back about the 20 years, I mean, when you really think back about it, the Taliban government was dispersed in October 2001. In November 2001, people don't know this, the Taliban offered to surrender. And Donald Rumsfeld arrogantly said, no, we don't negotiate a surrender. All the Taliban wanted at that time was amnesty. So here we are 20 years later. The US dropped 15,000 bombs on Afghanistan in the last 2 years. 250,000 Afghans are dead. 71,000 are civilians. And now the US government leaves in a panic after 20 years. And of course, all of those in Afghan society who allied themselves with the United States feel at risk. And so everything has been based on American arrogance and the inability to actually have an understanding of what's best for the Afghan people or the Afghan society. Again, every miscalculation that could have been made has been made. And the US generals knew for the last 8 years that this was a lost cause, but no political leader has taken responsibility for it. Right. Now Biden has, and he's getting all of the recriminations domestically and internationally. But frankly, the American people, and this goes to who Biden was speaking to, they're so sick of the Afghan war or the Iraq war or endless war that Biden's program and his credibility, I don't think is that strained at home.
Of course, you can judge from the tone of Mr. Becker. President Biden and his administration facing tremendous political pressure as a result of this latest chaotic exit from Afghanistan. Having said that, though, Mr. Yang, there are a lot of other issues that's between the G7. Hopefully, they can present a united picture with the other issues. For example, whether to recognize the Taliban regime or not. As we know that quote-unquote government is now being formed, consultation is in process. We do not know the nature of that consultation, how fair is that consultation, but we do know from the spokesperson of the Taliban that I talked to earlier that it is ongoing. So Mr. Yang, whether that regime will be recognized by the G7?
Well, not only in my observation, not only G7 countries, but also most of the countries in international community now are waiting and seeing what Taliban, the upcoming government, will do, how they can implement what they have committed. And if they commit, if they implement what they have committed, I think it won't be difficult, won't be a rocky road towards the recognition by the majority of international community, regardless.
But you know that the promise, Mr. Yang, once you are making the promise, the implementation could take years to see the final results. So, but there is a dilemma whether to recognize that regime now or not, because you have to deal with someone inside Afghanistan. Who is that going to be, right? So I think that there is an immediate question that needs to be answered right now, Mr. Yang.
Yeah, that's the contradiction between policy between what can policymaker can do and what the reality can development. Theoretically, it is indeed to make a decision of recognition in short time. But in reality, as you mentioned,
right.
all the commitment need, it will take time to implement all the commitments. But the key factor now facing all the related countries, especially the G7 country, is how to define the so-called inclusive government.
Well, there are a lot of adjectives there in that promise, in the agreement signed between the United States and the Taliban, together with several other partners. Many of them are G7 members. But how to translate the adjective into actions, those are the most important question, I guess, Mr. Yang.
Yeah.
Another thing, Professor Laris, is about the leverage that the G7 has been talking about over the Taliban. Right now, many of the leverages could be included in several categories. one, sanctions or not. two, recognition or not. three, whether the money will be given to the Taliban-led government, those money that belonged to also the earlier government, the Republic of Afghanistan. So, Mr. Laris, how do you see these leverages? How useful are they?
I think the leverage right now is very, very limited. Maybe in the next few weeks, when the withdrawal has been completed and the evacuation issue has also been resolved, maybe then leverage will increase a little regarding financial aid, humanitarian aid, World Bank loans to the Taliban. But right now, I can hardly see any leverage whatsoever. Clearly, the Taliban have the upper hand. They control the roads to the airport. They can say that the 31st of August will be the end. After that, there will be even military resistance. So the Allied powers really have to go to the Taliban cap in hand and ask for a favor and ask and beg the Taliban whether or not they can stay for a few more days to fly out people. So that leverage which we just talked about, recognition, sanctions or not, and things like that, that may come into play in a few weeks' time. It certainly isn't the case right now. And sanctions, just one word about sanctions. Of course, we know there might be a food crisis, a severe humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan by September, some UN organizations have predicted. That is not the time to impose sanctions on Afghanistan, and the international community wouldn't tolerate that. So I think, as I said before, leverage is very limited indeed.
I see. At the same time, China seeks a more constructive approach to Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. That is, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson today, Wang Wenbin told reporters on Tuesday. The international community, he said, should encourage and promote the development of the situation in Afghanistan in a positive direction. Imposing sanctions and pressure at every turn cannot solve the problem and will only be counterproductive. We should not repeat the tragedy after one certain country made a mistake. Now, Afghanistan and the entire international community, especially countries in the region, have to pay for it. End of quote. That is according to the Chinese spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mr. Yang. Interesting.
Well, firstly, as always, China never believed sanction as a policy tool can be workable, can be effective. In fact, it's hard to find any successful case indicating sanction works. So now that Afghanistan has fallen in a very complicated situation, I think any kind of sanctions on Afghanistan will be only contribute to a negative result rather than constructive result. That is why at the very beginning, China has expressed opposition about any sanction consideration.
Mr. Becker, what about sanctions? What about the money that it might be used as a leverage? And what about the recognition, all of these tools, quote unquote?
Sanctions are a form of war imposed powerful on those who are weaker. The United States is never sanctioned, for instance, or the UK, no matter what its conduct. But big countries, powerful countries, can sanction poorer countries. And so I think sanctions are an unconscionable act of war. It deprives the civilian population, food and medicine, and that which people need to live. The U.S. imposes sanctions and seizes assets of countries like Venezuela or Cuba or Iran. I think it should stop. I think the United States has to recognize the reality that the United States government is no longer the power in Afghanistan. There's a new government that's coming into existence. It will be dominated by the Taliban. There may be other political parties that are included. That would be the issue of inclusiveness. We don't know yet. But the United States, if anything, should pay reparations to Afghanistan. It has not been a benign mission. When the U.S. drops 70 or 80,000 bombs and missiles on a country in the name of nation building or stopping terrorism, that's performing terrorism. I mean, drone attacks, constant assaults against Afghan villages. The Afghan people, whether they like or hate the Taliban, they don't want to live under foreign occupation. And for me, as an American, I insist that the United States recognize the government of Afghanistan and have normal relations rather than use economic, diplomatic, or military tools to undermine other people in other countries. I think that's the way forward.
Right. We've been discussing a lot that there are many other issues that we haven't got the chance to discuss. For example, the fight against terrorism in that region, how Afghanistan will now be used as a harbor of terrorism and terrorist organizations. A lot of questions to be asked and answered, but for now, I want to thank the three of you joining us. Klaus Laris, Brian Becker, Yang XIYU. Gentlemen, thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, a Chinese military strategist pulls no punches in explaining why China looks forward to being in step with Afghanistan after the hasty retreat of U.S. and allied forces. Do stay tuned for that interview next. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The speed and scope of the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan have prompted introspection in the West over what went wrong after $2 trillion spent on a 20-year war effort. China, though, is looking forward. It is ready, according to some, to step into the void left by the hasty U.S. retreat to seize a golden opportunity, end of quote. This is according to Mr. Zhou Bo, senior colonel and former director of the Center for Security Cooperation at the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. Senior Colonel Zhou recently wrote an article entitled, "In Afghanistan, China is ready to step into the void," published on the front page of New York Times recently. In the article, he unpacked China's position on Afghanistan. For a closer look, I recently sat down with him and let him explain about China's strategies and positions. The latest situation in Afghanistan, enormous amount of uncertainty, whether in Kabul or in Panjshir Valley, or about the Afghanistan Taliban and the U.S. relations regarding the deadline of withdrawal. A lot of mixed things going on all at the same time. Senior Colonel Zhou, in the mid and long term, what is your judgment?
Currently, I think the focus of the United States is just on a very tiny spot, that is the airport. You have to evacuate as many Americans or Afghani interpreters who have worked for Americans as soon as possible. So that is a priority. In terms of the domestic situation, I think still there is uncertainty as well in that Afghanistan is never a unified country. Therefore, even if Taliban has taken power, what could happen in the future is still a question.
Under these circumstances, there are a lot of debate about what's going to be China's role and how is China thinking strategically about Afghanistan when the U.S. is leaving, quote, a strategic vacuum. Senior Colonel Zhou, it seems that you are arguing in a way that's not going to two extremes. One, China will fill the void. The other is China will not get involved in Afghanistan much because it's such a chaos. But you argue, apparently, go the middle way. Tell me more about it.
Well, talking about the role of China in the future, we have to come first to the past. The thing is, because of American-led war in Afghanistan, China's involvement in Afghanistan is not very big. But it's still fair to say that China has provided assistance, at least millions of dollars, to Afghan people throughout the warring years. And besides, we have a lot of economic interactions with Afghanistan, because the fact is China is one of the largest trading partners of Afghanistan. So as the trade volume actually has increased. So with the withdrawal of American troops, apparently the biggest barrier for investment is gone. I believe this is a very good chance in that Afghanistan is China's neighbor. We're connected by a border which is only 92 kilometers. So China's investment is worldwide. So why not in a direct neighbor if the situation there becomes more peaceful?
And that is a big if.
Yeah.
As you argued, Afghanistan was never really a united country over the past quite a few hundreds of years. And also, this time when the Taliban coming into power, apparently, whether China will recognize the government established by the Taliban, which is now still under discussion, is a big question mark. If you noticed what the Chinese State Councilor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said recently about China's hope about the styles of government together with the other parties of the international community for Afghanistan in future, it's open, inclusive, and well represented. So whether these adjectives will be the eventual result is a big question mark. Senior Colonel Zhou.
Yes, that is a big question, but at least the Taliban has expressed that they want to become inclusive, in that they have actually made some offers, for example, to the former President Karzai. So it remains to be seen. But as far as China is concerned, I think Foreign Minister Wang has made it quite clear that we wish Taliban to break away with all terrorist group, and the political head of Taliban during his visit to China and in his bilateral meeting with Wang has pledged that the Taliban would not allow any forces to use Afghan soil against China.
Three things just to add to what you just said, Senior Colonel Zhou. First of all, the relationship between Taliban and some of the widely recognized terrorist groups, whether in Afghanistan or the surrounding area, is a very tricky one. As you may know, many of these terrorist groups have been writing congratulation letters to the Taliban in Afghanistan for the current situation, that they got control of most of the country. Second, if you look at the Taliban's priorities right now, two. One is to have a government, mainly it has its say. Secondly, is to calm down the international community so that they could have less sanctions and maybe in the future have rebuilding and certainly have recognition of the government, the Taliban, which played a pivotal role. Third thing, if you look at how it is dealing with the promises, he's making all these promises to everybody with adjectives that's really up to interpretation. So if you look at the three areas, how much trust, Senior Colonel Zhou, given your strategic experience of China's military, how much trust China has toward a party like this?
Of course, we read the words, but we also read the deeds. It seems that this Taliban government looks at least somewhat different from the old one, in that the society has changed. Because right now, internet is applicable to at least 70 people in Afghanistan, and they even allow women to go to work, to go to school. This is totally different from what happened in the past. So hopefully, as they have expressed, Taliban will also change. Yeah. So this is the precondition, and that is, of course, in China's interest to see it change for the better. Of course, we understand it will remain very much a religious country, in that the name of the country is already identified, right? But still, we hope it is a tolerant society like the rest of the world.
So that is the precondition, as you said, Senior Colonel Zhou.
No, we cannot call it a precondition for China to deal with it because it's up to the Afghan people to decide about their own future, and that is China's policy, and it's also American policy to have the peace process of Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. So it's totally up to them because Taliban is also Afghan, right? So that is a kind of domestic affairs. But I think there is a kind of general wish from the international community that this society would become a tolerant and open society.
There are a lot of scenarios that's going on right now. One of the things for China to think about, Senior Colonel Zhou, I wonder, is how is China going to deal with some of the regional players and some of the players that has tremendous impact in Afghanistan as a result of earlier history?
Well, I think China really could play a very positive role in terms of Afghan's relationship with its immediate neighbors or with outside major powers. The country that would influence Afghanistan most is Pakistan because of historical cultural links, because of the fact that the Pashtun people actually are just tribes across the border, and because of the fact that Pakistan actually has accommodated 3 million Afghan refugees ever since the Soviet invasion. So the relationship between these two countries is described by former President Karzai as conjoined brothers. But these conjoined brothers do not always look in the same direction. Actually, I would argue almost safely that Afghan's relationship with India is probably better than its relationship with Pakistan. But Pakistan's influence there, of course, is stronger. But China actually would like to play a very important mediator role in pulling these two countries together. Actually, in a joint statement among the three countries, China has pledged to work to improve the relationship between these two countries. The other thing is, what would the United States do after its withdrawal from Afghanistan? Because of the United States' global influence, I do not foresee that the US will be a country of no action in Afghanistan, even after its withdrawal.
Many question the U.S. recent action to withdraw from Afghanistan ASAP, whether it has much to do, first of all, of course, with 20 years, not much result, and probably very negative results so far. But secondly, the U.S. strategic shift toward China. You heard that argument a lot. And it seems, well, the Afghan withdrawal of the U.S. troops is going on. You also have seen tremendous efforts made by the United States in recent days of China's neighbors.
It's fine if you want to enhance your bilateral relationship with any countries, but if you want to align yourself with these countries vis-à-vis China, the first question is not about how China might think. The question is how these countries might think, right? There are quite a few elements here. So these countries have seen how Americans have lost the so-called forever war in Afghanistan. And it's a heavy blow to the credibility of the United States, be it to its NATO allies, be it to his Asian allies, be it to his partners. This is not a secret. In the international media, every day people talk about the disappointment of Americans' performance. Then the fact is, he's visiting some of these ASEAN countries. Singapore and Vietnam are both ASEAN countries. These countries' best hope is to balance China-US relationship. Furthermore, to enhance the so-called ASEAN centrality. So in terms of these two conditions, I would say if he wants these countries to be united with the United States against China, it's not such an easy job.
Another scenario people talk about is that the United States has been strategically giving up, quote unquote, Afghanistan to plant, quote unquote, a bomb on the neighbor of China. First of all, there might be rise of terrorism. In fact, It is already a concrete number since the past 20 years of the US occupation of Afghanistan. And meanwhile, the complex web of relations in the region after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan will, for anyone, any big power in the region, to have huge challenge to handle. That, of course, includes China. Thirdly, when the rebuilding of the United States failed, it doesn't mean, some say, the US influence in Afghanistan vesper. Whether this is a bomb, from your perspective, possibly planted by the United States on the border of China.
No, I don't think so, because one of the best and recognized advantage of China in terms of its foreign policy is that it could manage to be friendly with all parties, even in warring countries. This is the most evident in the Middle East. Why China, while having heavy investment there, is relatively peaceful, that is because no countries in the Middle East would consider China would interfere in its domestic affairs. Besides, and more importantly, no countries would consider China would align itself to become enemy of this very country. So when we come to the future situation in Afghanistan, we don't know. But a good example is Pakistan. Yes, Chinese workers were attacked from time to time. That is a big surprise to us. But Pakistan is not a very stable country. And there are certain forces that are against the government. So in this regard, Chinese workers could be used as ransoms, or even such attacks could be a kind of a direct message to the Afghan government. It might not be necessarily against the Chinese. Of course, with Chinese now around the world, there definitely would be more dangers involved. For example, China's Belt and Road Initiative on the land is very much overlapping with the so-called arc of instability. That means Chinese are not only hard-working people, they're also brave people. And this is not only profitable for China, it's also a good chance for us to build up the infrastructure to improve the road condition of these countries so as to improve the standard of living.
What do you think, if China is strategically smart, should look at in terms of factors that's going on in Afghanistan and make sound judgment about its relationship with Taliban and with the upcoming government, quote unquote, in Afghanistan?
Well, I think right now China is vividly involved in talking to Taliban and the regional countries, because we have appointed a special envoy, Ambassador XIYU. I believe currently he is overseas, probably in Pakistan, talking to the relevant parties. So before making a decision by the Chinese government, I think it's necessary for us to talk to all the parties to find what is best for Afghanistan, and probably more important is for Afghan to tell us what it is going to do.
When Afghanistan is what it is, and possibly evolving as we speak, how is China in the longer term going to guarantee its security and going to be a stable player, strong strategic partner in this regard?
I think Shanghai Cooperation Organization really have to play an important role on Afghan issue, in that Afghan lies in the very center of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Yes, the organization talked about this issue, and because of the war that went on for 2 decades, in fact, there isn't much the Shanghai Cooperation Organization can actually do, but now the situation is different. And because of the fact that it lies in the very heart of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think, and it involves all Afghan's neighbors. Therefore, it is important for Shanghai Cooperation Organization to play a bigger role there.
There is a lot of talk about what is the takeaway from the so-called long war the U.S. had in Afghanistan 20 years. What do you think is the takeaway for China?
I think China, first of all, should stick to its foreign policy, never intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries. Because Afghanistan reportedly have something to do with 9/11, therefore American troops went there to fight against the Taliban, against any other forces. Militarily, it won, but when it dragged on, then it became chaos for the United States. So that really would provide good lessons to China in many fronts. One is in terms of your foreign policy, right? Do not intervene unless it is absolutely necessary, and do not intervene if it is the domestic affairs of other countries, and help these countries whenever possible. For example, if you read the military involvement of PLA overseas, putting all these different sorts of activities all together, be it counter-piracy, be it peacekeeping, be it disaster relief, whatsoever, they could be generalized as a cooperation, as a humanitarian aid, or the so-called efforts in addressing non-traditional threats. This is totally different from Americans' efforts in policing the world. If you assist the world but do not police the world, then the result is totally different. And but the question is, China is becoming more important. How could you assist the world? That is a good question, because we always say that we have to make contributions in line with our national strengths, right? But the question is, your national strength is ever growing. That means your capability is becoming stronger, and that means you could contribute more to the rest of the world. I always believe the motto of PLA is to serve the people. All Chinese know that. But who now are the people? In the 21st century, the people are the people of the world, not only Chinese people.
Senior Colonel Zhou Bo talking to us about China's possible strategy on Afghanistan. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.